live longer, feel better, have more peace, look at life a whole lot better. It's completely free. You don't have to sign up to any plan. You don't have to pay any money. Sounds like too good a true offer, doesn't it? But it's actually been something that's been around for thousands of years as we read in the Bible. But Dr. Dick Tibbits has really crystallized it for our current culture in his book, Forgive to Live, How Forgiveness Can Save Your Life, backed up by medical research that shows how your blood pressure can go down and you live better. He has written this, and it's a 10th anniversary book he's put out, including some new updates around self-forgiveness, which we're going to talk about in this conversation as well. You have joined such an important conversation on the podcast today. Please like, rate, review, share this podcast with others, give it 5 stars. That helps the algorithms get out to more people. It's always for free, but we just love getting these stories out to more and more people. All right, let's get chatting to Dr. Dick Tibbits. Dick, thanks so much for your time.
It's a joy to be with you, and it's fun to work with someone halfway around the world.
It is great to have a chat to you, and especially someone who has dedicated so much of their time to understanding this idea of forgiveness. And whether you have sort of a faith perspective or not, I think we all understand that we need to forgive in some way, shape or form. Before we get into some of the details in this book, talk to me about why for you did you suddenly get so interested in forgiveness?
Well, I worked at a hospital, Florida hospital in Orlando, Florida, and they partnered with the Walt Disney World to create a healthcare system or a hospital called Celebration Health. And the notion of that hospital was to offer healing interventions based on the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. And what I discovered was spiritual interventions were very thin. I mean, other than a chaplain praying with a patient, there wasn't much we did. And so I designed a study teaching people with high blood pressure, referred to me by their physician, how to forgive as a way of managing their blood pressure. And as a result of doing that study, was able to demonstrate both clinically and statistically that forgiveness is a very helpful intervention to help manage heart disease.
Was it something that when you first started that you thought this would be the case, or was it more well, let's give this a shot and see if this actually makes a difference?
Great question. Actually, some research had been done in front of me, research showing that anger is a risk factor for heart disease. And that work was endorsed by the American Heart Association, the National Institute of Health, various organizations in Australia also identify anger as a risk factor for heart disease. So my unique contribution was, how can we help people reduce anger in an effective way? And I believe that forgiveness, once we understand it, is a very effective tool to help lower my resentment, my hostility, the hurt that I've experienced from others, so that I can move on with my life. And one of the extra pluses is it can also improve your health.
One of the things that you tell beautifully in the book, and obviously in any of the speaking you do and the work that you've actually done from it, is that sort of the outcome of that is this great practical living. It's this idea of the lower blood pressure and better ideas, but there is sort of this idea of a path that's needed to get there, as it were, and it starts with recognizing it. And there's a number of different ways that you've said, well, this is how we have to actually start recognizing it. From your perspective, how self-aware does somebody need to be to start realizing, actually, I might need to go on a path of forgiveness? Or is this something that just by somebody saying it to them, hey, you should do a path of forgiveness, they can start walking down that?
Yes. Well, forgiveness is not the first thing that comes to our mind when we've been hurt by somebody. And so part of my message is that needs to come into play. You need to consider that. You need to think about that. And so when I taught this program, I had to teach people how to forgive because people had no idea how to do that. And so how do you teach that? You know, in church, we hear sermons that we should forgive. And so we walk out saying, yeah, I probably should, but what do I do? And so part of my task was to break forgiveness down into very clearly defined cognitive behavioral steps where I can think about something and then act on it and do it in a way that makes sense, that translates easily, and that people can go out and do. And so that was really the bulk of this book is, how did I teach people how to forgive? What are the steps? What do I do? Where do I begin? And so once you realize that you're carrying hurt from someone who has said something about you, someone who has done something to you, and you don't know what to do with it, and it repeats itself in your mind over and over and over again, I want that person to consider forgiveness as an effective way of dealing with one's hurts, pains, resentments, and struggles.
Um, you talk about a number of different topics in the book. We obviously can't go through all of those today, but one of the things that you do talk about is a grievance story, which is quite an intense description. But I think you just so beautifully explain it. Could you help those who are listening, watching now to understand what we mean by a grievance story and why actually that's a really important part of us needing to go on a journey of forgiveness?
Well, grief, we all know what grief is. When we lose a loved one, we grieve the loss. Well, a grievance story is really a story in my head about losses in my life. Loss of self-worth. Somebody puts me down and all of a sudden I'm feeling like I'm damaged. Loss of a job. Someone can say something about me that hinders my career. Loss of a special friendship because someone said something hurting to me. And so when I have these losses, the story becomes embedded into my head so that I think about this over and over and over again. Think about your situation, to my audience that's listening today. Someone says something bad about you, and right away you're playing in this tape in your head. Why did they say that? What did they mean by that? What do they have against me? And the hurt and the anger gets played through over and over and over again. In fact, one of the things I say about grievance stories is they can be 1 day old, 1 week old, 1 month old, 1 year old. And yet when I think about them, they're just as real as the moment they happened. And it's these stories that get embedded into my thoughts. They become, I call them autoplay tapes. They just play over and over again. That if I don't do anything about it, they keep repeating themselves. And here's what I want our listeners to know, that a grievance story is not just a thought. It is also an emotional reaction. I feel that grief. I feel that hurt. I feel that loss. And one more step in that puzzle is not only do I feel it, but my body reacts to it. My body actually produces hormonal messengers that signal my body to the emotion I'm feeling. So if I'm feeling happy, it releases endorphins into my bloodstream, and they give me this sense of well-being and happiness and joy. If I'm angry, my body releases cortisol into my bloodstream, which stresses me and elevates heart rate. And so one of the things I want our listeners to realize is that this grievance story not only plays in your head, it plays throughout your entire body.
And I think as you do describe it, everyone's like, oh yeah. And as I was reading about the grievance stories, I thought of something for me many, many years ago in a work situation of somebody who hurt multiple people. And the final time I was reaching out to try and look after this person, and they just tore me apart for trying to look after them. And have literally never heard of them since. In fact, they've gone and deliberately hurt our organisation again. And so, whether it's big or small, whether it's from years ago or not, you can start playing out those stories. As we do it and we sort of identify we have that, it does lead to a space essentially of, well, what are we going to do with that? Okay, we have a story. I've identified a bit of that story. What am I going to do? And the opportunity is to just stay with it, right? And we've all probably seen people who literally decades on, and we've heard the stories of families who still won't talk to each other or whatever, because essentially these grievance stories have continued and they've never actually dealt with it. So your thesis is actually the way is forgiveness. Before we get to how you actually start doing that, is there any other way that you see, or is actually forgiveness the only way to get through that grievance story?
So the question with the grievance story is, what do I do with it? How do I resolve it? And so I start by saying, something needs to change. The person needs to apologize. The person needs to do something, make restitution. And so I go down that pathway hoping it will get fixed. Well, if the other person cooperates, it may happen, but what if the other person doesn't care? What if they've gone on with their life? It's not bothering them, it's bothering me. And so my first attempt to try to fix it, to correct it, to get an apology Once I realize that's not going to work, then I tend to default to some type of revenge. If nothing more in my mind, I'll get even with you. I'm going to do something to fix this. So I go from hoping they will do something and then realizing that's not going to happen to I'm going to do something. I'm going to get even. I'm going to make things balance. I'm going to bring justice to this. And then I find that that's often more difficult, more complicated, probably not going to work. I don't have the leverage. I don't have the position to do that. And so then I come to probably the third step in the line, but really the most important step, the one that really works. And that is, I need to apply forgiveness to this. And the reason for that is, I'm the one that's being hurt. I'm the one that's suffering. I'm the one that's carrying this. And I have to find an effective way of letting it go. And forgiveness, and we'll get into defining that in a little bit, but forgiveness is a way of letting it go. Forgiveness is a way of redefining it. Forgiveness is a way of resolving it for me so that I can move on with my life. Because without that, the story plays on, the problems continue, and I am stuck. I am really the consequence of someone else's action towards me, or as we like to say, I become the victim of someone else's behavior towards me. And forgiveness is the way I move from victim to victor. And as you understand that and as you practice that, you will experience that success.
How do we be careful in that space? As I was going through the book, I did think about this idea that there is, we don't want to stay in a victim mentality, but there are times where we are a victim of something. And so we have to sort of understand the difference of those, I suppose, as well, that, at times, things happen to us. The world is not perfect. Bad things are going to occur. So is there a way to actually move from, and I'm thinking of especially of people who've gone through really terrible things, to go from to be okay to be a victim, but not live in a victim mentality?
Yeah. So I can't stop being a victim. Somebody's going to do something to me. I'm going to be hurt. I wish I could say that happened once in my life and it was done, but it happens over and over and over again. So, and for some people, their victimization is deep: childhood abuse, sexual abuse, betrayal and infidelity in a marriage, loss of a job and being fired for something that somebody did toward me or said about me that had nothing to do with what I did. So I'm clearly experiencing victimization from others. However, I now have to make a choice. Will I live my life as a victim, playing that tape over and over again, or will I learn from that situation and find a way out? So I hear stories all the time. In fact, my own personal story mirrors that, where I'll give a quick example. I was working in an institution. I was there for a decade, doing well, working hard, progressing through, promotions. And then all of a sudden, I'm fired. I'm laid off. That's it. Well, I'm at mid-age. I didn't know what opportunities I would have, what chances I would have. There was no jobs waiting for me. And I simply stayed at home for a while and lived in my victimization. Got depressed, didn't eat right, didn't exercise right. My social life tanked because all my friends were at work and they had to stay in work context, and I was out of context of that. It was a terrible experience. I thought in my head all kinds of ways of getting back at the person who fired me, all the things that we talked about in the grievance story. Eventually, and it took months, eventually I got a job working in another institution, lower level job, paying less, but at least it was work. But you know what? If I hadn't gone to that new place, I would have never written the book on forgiveness. I would have never had a chance to do something that my other job never created for me. I would have never been challenged to think of a spiritual intervention and whole person health. So in looking back, my life was blessed because of that. So what I want to encourage people is if you're on a road of pain, and we get there, and we will get there in life, you have to ask yourself the question, do I want to stay here or do I want to move on? And that's the difference between being a victim and being victimized. I'm victimized when I stay there. I'm a victim when someone does something to me. So I want to encourage people that if you have been victimized, if you have been hurt by someone else, you have a choice to make. Will you live out that life and play that life over and over again? Or will you learn from that experience and move on to something better? And that's the decision that I believe forgiveness will help you to move on. But it's a choice you have to make, and it's a choice you have to make when you're ready to make it. I was hurting for months. I wasn't ready to make that choice, but eventually, you don't get a paycheck long enough and reality starts to set in. Eventually you realize I'm the only one that's suffering. Everyone else is working and moving on with their life. I need to do something, and I need to figure out how to get from here to there. And forgiveness was that concept that really moved me, and I trust that it'll move you as a listener in this audience.
And I think it's important we're not trying to say that therefore says that abuse was okay, or whatever happened in the past was okay. It's very different, right? Forgiveness is not about saying that was okay. You're very clear in the book as you talk about that too, Dick, that we're not saying that means it's okay, but it is a way that we can then start moving forward as well. Some
of the concepts we have for forgiveness really aren't forgiveness. So forgiveness, one of the most common statements we have is forgive and forget. If I forgive, I'll just forget it. No, forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is remembering in a different way. Well, if we forgive someone, we got to get back together. We got to like that person again. Well, forgiveness is not condoning. If somebody did something bad to me, the fact that I have to forgive it means that something bad was done. I don't forgive happy things. So the fact that forgiveness comes into play tells me that something wrong happened. And finally, forgiveness isn't necessarily reconciliation. People think, well, if I forgive, we got to be friends again. Not necessarily. So I like to say, I say this in my book, that while forgiveness is free, trust must be earned. Forgiveness and trust are two different things. I can forgive someone and still not trust them, still need boundaries in place. And that's okay. Forgiveness doesn't mean, oh, you hurt me, but that's okay. We're best friends. It doesn't matter.
It's interesting. I've actually, I referenced an example before, and I've had some others as well, where I've had to go through a path of forgiveness of things I realized I was holding on to for people. I haven't spoken to them again. Like they're other countries, they're other places, but there was a need for me to actually be free of that, and to actually say, well, I'm going to forgive them for some of the things they did, and at one point it was even, I'm going to even forgive them just for being human and the fact that they screw up. But I needed to go down that path because I was the one that was hurting because of that. So I think that's certainly something that can happen and can occur.
It does happen, Clayton. I like to say it this way. When I forgive, I let myself off the hook. You see, one of the reasons I don't want to forgive is because I don't want to let them off the hook. I want to continue to let them be punished. I want them. But the truth is, the only one suffering is me. And so forgiveness is not about letting them off the hook. They're going to do what they're going to do. I'm not responsible for their life. But I've got to let myself off the hook. I've got to forgive so that I'm not retaining the anger and the hurt, so that I can move on and say, what can I learn from this? How can I do things differently? Who else out there in this world can I connect with that can be helpful with me? And forgiveness is a way of reducing that noise, that grievance story, so that I can be thinking in a different way. And that's part of what forgiveness is we'll get into. How do I reframe the situation? How do I see it differently so that I'm not trapped by it, but I become stronger through it so that I can move on?
We're going to be talking more about what forgiveness is, how we do that. I also want to ask Dr. Dick Tibbits, the author of this book, Forgive to Live, How Forgiveness Can Save Your Life, around, in Australian and New Zealand context, we're all about resilience and pushing through and things like that. So what does it mean for us? And how should that be playing out for us as well? That's on the way next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielen. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
Dick, let's talk, first of all, if I could, with the question I sort of left us with just a few moments ago, which is around really this sort of identity that we have here in Australia and New Zealand, or a lot of Australians and New Zealanders do, which is, we're tough, we're resilient, we can sort of get through anything, the harsh environments, and often that plays out. And I suppose I'm especially thinking of the male culture as well, that, the best way to deal with things is just put things down, don't think about them, and move on. That seems to be the opposite of forgiveness, or dealing with that, and especially as what's going to help for us. Have you, in your research and in your discussions, found that different cultures do need to actually apply forgiveness different ways, or is it pretty universal?
So I think there is a difference of cultures and approach. So you talk about the stiff upper lip, the grit it and bear it and move on. And that's different in other cultures, which are much more relational oriented and much more aware of how I'm affecting you and you're affecting me, teamwork, etc. But what I tell people is if that resilience is working for you, that's fine. There are times in my life when I couldn't deal with it. I had to keep moving on. I had to keep getting things done. But here's the problem. I'm really not resolving things. I'm just pushing them to the back burner so that I can stay focused on the things I need to get done. And eventually that back burner gets hotter and hotter. And the way I know that is I react more quickly to situations. Things bother me more quickly. And what that means is I'm tapping into that pool of what I've suppressed and repressed and pushed down. So if you need to be tough to get through something, more power to you. But if you feel that heat, that pain, that recurring story, then that's a clue that you need to back up and you need to find that time to forgive. Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, his life was thrust into a concentration camp and in the worst of circumstances. And so he observed some people just try to plow through it and get through it, but they couldn't escape it. It was just too overwhelming. And he said, you know what? He said, in this environment between stimulus and response, we need to spend time reflecting. What can we do with our lives? What opportunities do we have? This is my situation. I can't control the world. I can't control everything around me, but I can control my inner life. And I think it's that reflection, which is a part of resilience. It helps me to kind of get a perspective on things. So yes, while some people take things more head on, other people want to process more. There are those cultural differences. At the end of the day, I can't escape what lies below the surface because it will surface. It will come up at the most unexpected times. And so I want to encourage everyone that when the time is right for you, when you're feeling this resentment, this hurt, this grievance story, if you will, that it's a reminder that I have some work to do. And I call that work forgiveness because it comes from a rich tradition within religious groups and spiritual organizations that somehow, if we're going to live together in an imperfect world, we're going to have to figure out how to move beyond the hurts and pains. And forgiveness is what has worked over the centuries.
Let's talk a bit about, we've mentioned it a few times, and we've started sort of defining what forgiveness is and the depths of it, but maybe let's get a bit deeper into that. What do you actually mean by forgiveness when you're encouraging us, okay, well, if that's those moments, we need to forgive someone and go through a grievance story and understand and then actually step into forgiveness? So
defining forgiveness is like defining love. You kind of get it, but it's hard to do. So I'm going to give you some things that help you to get it. So at the bottom level, I define forgiveness as giving up my right to hurt you for the hurt you've done for me so that my hurt can come to an end. I have to give it up because if I don't, then I hold on to it and I hold on to my anger and my resentment. So in one way, it's just simply giving up my right to hurt you for hurting me. Another way of defining it is I'm giving up all hope for a better past so that I can have a better future. You see, when I don't forgive, I am really stuck in the past. I keep playing what's happened with no way out. And so in some ways, I became chained to the past that other people have done to me. And I see this so often that people live in an environment of entrapment that my life could have been better, but this is what happened. And so I say forgiveness is giving up all hope for a better past so that I can move on. In the simplest way, Forgiveness is letting go rather than hanging on. And forgiveness is a process of letting go. And that's where the definition of the practical application of forgiveness comes into play. Because what I'm holding on to is my thoughts and my memories. And that's what shapes my past, and that's what also influences my future. Forgiveness is a process of reframing the past. And here's why. If I like someone, I tend to notice all their good characteristics. And this is where we get the notion love is blind, right? When you're in love with someone, all you see is the good points, no matter what someone else says to you. So my daughter was dating her boyfriend in high school. I'm going, there's some things you need to be paying attention to here, and she wasn't. Love is blind. Well, the corollary to that is just as true. Anger is equally as blind. So when I'm upset at someone, all I see is their bad points. That's how someone's best friend can become their worst enemy, simply by what I focus on. The person's the same person. They didn't change. What I'm focusing on changes. I see this in marriages all the time. We're in love, now we can't stand each other. What changed? Well, what changed is what I'm focusing on. And so forgiveness is a very practical process of reframing how I see things. Adding things to my picture that I eliminated because I'm upset. Recognizing that the person that I'm upset at, yeah, they did some things that were upsetting to me. Yeah, they've got some bad characteristics, but they also have some good characteristics. I wasn't totally off base. As I begin to see the good and the bad in everyone, I begin to get a different point of view, a different frame of reference. Remember, how I see things really depends on my frame of reference, my point of view. And so forgiveness really is reframing. It's bringing the good in with the bad. I'll give a biblical illustration of this for our Christian audience. When the Roman centurions were nailing Jesus to the cross, it's interesting how he reframed that. Rather than being angry at what they were doing, which is probably what I would have done, he says, Father, forgive them. Why? Because they don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the larger context. And so reframing is not only mixing the good and the bad so it's not all bad, but it's also enlarging the frame of context. It's seeing the bigger picture. It's realizing that this event is an event of time and history in one point. It's not all the points. It's not everything. Oh, it feels like everything. I may be making it everything in my head, but it's really not. And there are other things I need to allow into my life to reframe, to enlarge the frame of reference, so that I can now see multiple options in my life as opposed to being locked into one event.
Yeah. You put a beautiful, really simple illustration, a literal illustration in your book around that, this idea of, zoomed in someone crying and you think, oh, well, what's that going to be? Like all you see is a face crying and you feel empathy. Then it zooms out a little bit more and it's that same face crying behind bars, and straight away you're like, oh, well, probably deserved it. And then it zoomed out again and you realised actually someone's filming it. It's a movie set. And so what do I feel about that? And just a simple illustration made me, I was just off wondering about how do I reframe things? How do I look at things in different ways? It really is quite remarkable. The opportunity to keep stepping back if I can, to try and understand as much as possible. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be okay. I'm not excusing things, but I'm just trying to understand. And that's, I think, super valuable. It certainly was a great point that I took away.
Clay, that's a good point. So in my situation, when I was let go, I could only look at my boss through eyes of anger and hurt. And while I enjoyed him, we had a good friendship, now all of a sudden I don't want to talk to him. Well, it's funny how the Lord works. So when I left that place and went to another place, after I did some research and worked in the forgiveness book and everything else, the organization asked me to be the vice president of human resources. Well, now all of a sudden I'm having to deal with people every day who are being laid off of work. And for one reason or another, this had 14,000 employees, so every day something's going to happen to someone. And all of a sudden I realized that my experience had a purpose. I didn't understand it at the time, but now it made sense to me. And so I encourage people who are just overwhelmed and confused to realize that there is a purpose for your life, and you may not understand it now, but it will emerge as you reframe, as you look at it. And so I began to see that I can help people who are going through a very significant, terrible situation, to help them to see that, you know what, this doesn't define you. This doesn't make you a bad person. This may be nothing more than a conflict between you and your boss. Don't overread it. Don't let it dominate your life. I know, I've been there. And so I'm sharing with you out of my experience that right now you're probably not ready to forgive at all. You got to go through the grieving process. Remember the Kubler-Ross grieving process of shock and anger and all of that. You've got to go through that. That's understandable. But don't forget that you have an option to forgive and to find a new pathway to move on. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah. And this might be framed wrongly, Dick, so please forgive me if that's the case. But as you described forgiveness there's a part of, as you described, what we needed to sort of let go of. Okay, I'm going to let go of hurting them, even though probably they deserved it. These sorts of various things that you just described. There feels like, and this might be the wrong wording, but I'm wanting to deliberately push into it. It feels like I have to let go of justice, or at least what my version of justice is, to be able to get there. Is that a fair description, or am I overplaying that a bit too much?
So no, forgiveness doesn't negate justice. What forgiveness does is, number one, I may never be able to get justice. And so does that mean I stay the victim of an unjust act? Or do I recognize I live in an imperfect world and justice doesn't always work out perfectly? So if someone fired me unjustly and I have a case, I can go to labor law and appeal it. I can go to HR and say, I think it was wrong. I'd like to have another consideration. And sometimes that works. So justice does play out. In fact, not sometimes, but the majority of times. But I want to be clear, it doesn't always play out. There are unjust things that are done in an imperfect world, and I cannot correct it. And so now I've got to say, do I let go of that and so that I can move on, or do I keep rehearsing other ways? So there is a place for the judicial system. There is a place to seek out justice, and I encourage people who have been victims of someone else's behavior to do that. That's not negating forgiveness. But forgiveness comes into play when justice doesn't come into play. And what do I do then? You know, we use the illustration of Christ on the cross. That was an unjust act. And we all recognize that as an unjust act. But there was no way it was going to be corrected at that time and at that place. I see parents, an organization, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, for example. These are parents who lost their children to a drunk driver. And they've played out the judicial system. And the judicial system is not going to lock them into jail for the rest of their lives. They're not going to execute them because they were drunk and they made a stupid decision and had bad consequences. So I encourage, and I've encouraged a number of mothers who have had lost childhood to that, to say, do something about it. Advocate for it. Help other parents who have been through it. Be a voice. You have an opportunity here. Terrible experience. And you can either live your life bitter about that person who did that stupid, drunken thing and destroyed my life and feel powerless because I've already gone as far as the judicial system will take me, or I can go a step further and I can help. I can use my experience to help others. And forgiveness is a process that allows me to do that because I'm reframing the situation. I'm moving out of my victimization. I'm recognizing that life isn't fair. And that forgiveness is a tool that all throughout history, you read stories in the Bible, stories in history, where people who couldn't get justice, couldn't correct something terrible happened, discovered forgiveness and was able to move to a new place in life. And I think that's what forgiveness does. So it doesn't negate justice. It doesn't force me into a relationship that would be unproductive and hurtful. But it doesn't leave me trapped in the victimization and in the grievance story that was created by someone else's action towards me.
It's interesting. We have an example here in Australia that last year was, headline news as one gentleman forgave exactly that scenario, a drunk driver who taken 3 of his kids and one of his nieces, nephews, and went through a story of forgiveness. Actually, now goes and meets with this person in jail. They've come to a faith in Jesus as well. Since from this and this, deserve to be in jail for forever and is not trying to get out anytime soon, sort of thing. But there is a remarkable choice that said, I can't live in this bitterness. I have to forgive. It's a live example for us that has been played out in the very public media here in Australia, which has been a wonderful example of that, and shocking in all the good ways in that sense too. Yeah. Dick, we're running out of time, but a couple of questions I do want to ask as we go. Faith is a huge part, and a Christian faith is a part of your life. We've referenced that a few times. It's not. My sense is, as I've lived a life of following Jesus for a long time, that I do feel like that's an impetus. I should be forgiving. He's called me to do that. But forgiveness is not just for people of faith, is it?
No. Well, so there's several dynamics of forgiveness. One is there's my relationship with the Lord, and I am a sinner, and I need to be forgiven. So the way I learn about forgiveness is that that God was the first forgiver, and he forgave us while we were yet sinners, right? So that's one element. That's a very religious element. That's between me and God and how I deal with the sin problem and find faith in Christ. There's another level, and that's in the human level, and that's one to another. And the problem is, if I don't forgive, eventually there's not going to be anybody left in the world to be friends with, because people always hurt. And so what do I do with that? Can I learn from the way God has forgiven me to be forgiving of others? And so there's a couple of little phrases that are memorable that might help you remember it. In my book, I say, you simply cannot swallow a poison pill and hope the other person dies. So holding on to my anger is not going to work. It's only hurting me. It's not hurting them. God recognized that in his relationship with me. If he held my sins against me, then he's not a loving God, and I'm not a forgiven person. So it's very important. And finally, I would say this, that I forgive because it is healthy for me. It really is. It's the only antidote to set me free. I share a story in the book of 2 prisoners from Vietnam who came to the Vietnam Memorial, and they were both POWs. And both of them experienced bitter torture, a terrible place to be through no fault of their own. And one prisoner says to the other, "Have you forgiven your captors yet?" And the other one responds, "No, never. I will never, ever forgive them for what they've done." And his friend turns back to him and says these words, "Then I guess they still have you prisoner, don't they?" You see, when I don't forgive, I'm imprisoned by the hurts and the injustices and the things that were done to me with no way out, because I live in a sinful world that these things happen. Forgiveness is the way out. It's the way out spiritually in my relationship with Christ. It's the way out relationally in my experience with others. Interesting, I'll end with this. The boss who let me go, who I never want to talk to again, well, the Lord has a strange way of making things work. 7 years later, guess what? He gets a job in the same organization that I'm working in, and he is higher up in the organization than I am. And I'm going, oh no, here we go again. No, I said, I'm not going back down that road. So I made an appointment with him and went up and talked to him. And I said, I'll just call him Jerry. We'll make up a name. I said, Jerry, I need to talk to you about my feelings towards you as a result of the decision that was made when I was let go. He says, boy, am I glad you brought that up. I didn't know how to broach it. I didn't know how to talk about it. He says, I didn't want to let you go. The board said we had to reduce our FTE count and gave us a number. And we sat through and processed that, and we hated to let you go. But when we looked at the positions we had, your position wasn't essential for the organization. It wasn't because of you. It wasn't because we didn't like you or you're doing a bad job. The board had dictated to us that we had to reduce our FTE count. And I want you to know I'm sorry I did that, but I had no choice. Well, that reframed the situation, didn't it? I thought he had something against me. He fired me because he didn't like me, or I knew I was doing my job, so it wasn't that. That conversation reframed things, and we were able to move from that point on and work together. So While forgiveness doesn't always create that kind of unity, I've already said that, it can. And it does create the opportunity. And without forgiveness, there is no opportunity to rebuild a relationship. So forgiveness doesn't require that, but it does create the opportunity. And that gentleman and I rebuilt our trust together and worked together successfully until we both retired.
Dick, we've gone over time, but I'm going to ask a quick, small question about an addition in your book, if that's okay. You talk about, and in the 10th anniversary one, we talk a bit more around self-forgiveness. And this sort of idea that sometimes we hurt ourselves and we need to forgive ourselves. The intent, I think, of this is not to say, to excuse bad behaviour, but there is an aspect of what does self-forgiveness mean, and especially if we have done different things. And maybe it's fine to just quickly summarise and wrap up. Is the path massively different to the forgiveness of others that we've talked about, or is there a nuance that we do need to look at?
I think it's significantly different, but the pathway is similar. So let me explain. Interesting enough, the Bible never speaks about self-forgiveness. It assumes that if God has forgiven you, you are forgiven. That's a pretty good assumption. So if I'm not forgiving myself when God forgives me, then what's going on? And what I've discovered is that most lack of self-forgiveness is really about low self-worth. I don't feel good about myself. I've been given the message over and over again from childhood up that you're not smart, you're not capable, you're not good, you're dumb, whatever it is. And so I quickly turn to problems must be my fault. And thus I'm blaming myself constantly for this and that and the other thing. And so self-forgiveness is really about two things. One is recognizing that there is nothing that I have done that God can't forgive. And I need to believe that and claim that so that I can be lifted up by his power. But the other thing I need to realize is a lot of my guilt and a lot of my low esteem is coming from low self-worth. And I need to realize that I'm not leftover genetics. I'm not bad material. I'm a child of God. And as such, I have a purpose in life. As such, I have a meaning in life. And so I need to be forgiving myself so that I'm not capped and pushed down. And thus, once I realize that, then the process of forgiveness becomes very similar. I'm holding on to a grievance story that I'm no good and that other people have told me no good and that I resent that. Well, I need to reframe that. Who told me I was no good? Why did they tell me that? Has anyone ever told me I had possibilities? Why are they telling me that? Everyone isn't saying I'm bad. It's just I'm listening to those voices louder. Who told me I'm a good person? Do I have a friend that's told me that? Do I have a teacher that told me that? Did I have a classmate? Start reframing that picture and start letting go of the negative messages, the bad messages, the poison pills, if you will, and to say, I have more to offer than that. And I am forgiven, and therefore I don't need to live there. Remember, forgiveness is about setting me free. It's about letting me go. It's about letting me move on. It's about disconnecting me from the past that's held me back. It's really, in religious terms, it's the conversion story. I am forgiven, and my life now has new meaning and purpose. So yes, self-forgiveness is different because it's overlaid with low self-worth. But in some ways, it's the same journey, only I've got to forgive myself. It becomes more complicated because I know what I've done, and I know that it's bad. And so I can't, maybe they didn't know that they did this to me. I know. But there's a lot that I'm forgetting, that I'm not putting into my knowing about how God sees me, how others see me, that is different than how I see myself. Reframing the journey of forgiveness. Yes.
Dr. Dick Tibbits is the author of the book Forgive to Live, How Forgiveness Can Save Your Life. It's the 10th anniversary edition. You've been the forgiveness guy for a while. It's a pretty cool name, Dick, to be called like that. I'm guessing, as you've been open as well, that there's always going to be opportunities for you to keep forgiving, especially when you're talking about it so much. So thank you for your vulnerability and sharing some of your stories as well, and for chatting to us today on Towards Understanding.
Thank you, Clayton. It was a joy, and more than a joy, I'm hoping it's a blessing to those who heard, and that they will consider forgiveness. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. And if you need help forgiving, get the help, talk to someone, read my book, whatever you need to do. Don't give up, because forgiveness works. I've seen too many, hundreds and thousands of people who have gone through forgiveness training, who have learned about forgiveness, change their lives. And I want to encourage our listeners that it can change your life too.
Dr. Dick Tibbits has been my guest as we've headed towards a better understanding on forgiveness.